Forget the romantic fairy tales and heroic images sold to you from the screen. We're stepping into the filthy backstage, where male beauty was a commodity, and the road to fame ran through the bedrooms of powerful industry matrons. In Hollywood, where everything had a price, these handsome men became living toys in the hands of women who possessed power, money, and a ruthless will. They were not merely acting out love, they were trading their bodies and their dignity for a coveted contract or the next role. These are stories of how idols worshipped by millions were turned into obedient gigolos, fulfilling the dirtiest whims of domineering old women who kept them on a leash made of checkbooks and studio influence. Prepare to see the dark underside of triumph, where masculinity was nothing more than merchandise for sale in this merciless snake pit. But before we move on to the first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
Cary Grant was not merely an actor. He was the most meticulously constructed image in modern history. His flawless accent, impossible to pin to any place on the map. His polished manners, his ability to wear a tuxedo as if he had been born in it, all of this was a screen concealing the battered soul of Archibald Leach, a destitute boy from Bristol whose mother was committed to a psychiatric institution and never returned. That primal fear of hunger and oblivion became the engine that transformed Grant into one of the most expensive and sophisticated gigolos of his era. He understood early on, in this world you are either the hunter or the prey, but if you are handsome enough, you can become a living diamond in the collection of those who rule it. Grant lost control of his own identity, dissolving completely into the role of a professional companion for powerful women whose age and wealth allowed them to buy other people's lives in bulk. His ascent was not paved with roses, it was laid with cold calculation in the bedrooms of Broadway and Hollywood matrons. Before becoming a star of the first magnitude, Cary Grant was the perfect toy for those who sought aesthetic pleasure in the company of a beautiful man. His hunger for security, something only the money of older women could provide, was ungovernable. His cruelty toward himself lay in total rebirth. He methodically burned away everything human, leaving only a glossy facade. He accepted gifts, tailored suits, and the right to live in luxurious mansions, offering in return his body, his time, and his submission. These women, often marked by foul tempers and a pathological need to dominate, saw in him a pedigreed stallion to parade in public and provoke envy among their friends. And Grant played the role flawlessly, indulging his owner's whims with the same diligence he would later apply to rehearsing his legendary comic timing. The peak of his career as an elite-kept man was his marriage to Barbara Hutton, heiress to the Woolworth Empire and one of the richest women on the planet. The union, which the press mockingly dubbed Cash and Cary, was a pure transaction, with Cary serving as a golden leash for a mentally unstable and domineering millionaire. Hutton was a woman accustomed to believing that every man had his price, and Grant was no exception. While basking in the glow of her colossal fortune, he was forced to endure her crushing depression, her whims, and the complete erosion of his own will. He became a gigolo of the highest order, living in a house where even the air did not belong to him. His own brand of cruelty revealed itself in how coldly he used her resources to secure independence from the studios. He was the only actor of his time to become a true free agent, and that freedom was bought at the cost of hours spent in the bed of a powerful woman he did not love, but whose checkbook he revered. Cary Grant's tragedy was that even after becoming a millionaire and the idol of millions, he could not stop being a gigolo in his own mind. His stinginess and his constant search for advantage in relations with women were uncontrollable. He always chose those who could offer something to his status: youth, money, or influence. He sold his sincerity early on, exchanging it for the chance to become the Cary Grant he had always wanted to be. His life is a story of a man rising from the lowest depths to the highest circles, only to remain a submissive servant to his powerful benefactresses. Grant is remembered as the perfect gentleman, but now we know that beneath that impeccable silk lay the skin of a classic gigolo who built his fame on the art of pleasing those who held the keys to his golden cage. He was the first and most successful on the list of men who turned their masculinity into a commodity, proving that in Hollywood the brightest shine always carries a dark aftertaste of calculation and sale.
Gary Cooper was the embodiment of the American spirit, tall, taciturn, with an open gaze that seemed to promise honesty and unshakable courage. Millions of men wanted to be like him, and millions of women dreamed of his protection. Yet behind this facade of the true American hid one of Hollywood's most calculating and obedient gigolos. Cooper possessed a rare talent. He knew how to convert outward modesty into access to the boundless resources of powerful women who turned his life into a sequence of paid adventures. His cruelty was passive. He allowed women to destroy themselves for his comfort, becoming a living trophy in the hands of those with money and status. He lost control of his freedom so early that by the time the Academy Awards came his way, he was already a professional piece of decor in the boudoirs of wealthy widows. His road to fame began not with remarkable roles, but with intimate ties to women whose age and standing in the industry allowed them to open any door. Cooper was a silent predator in the bedroom. He never demanded, he merely accepted with gratitude. He pleased those who could whisper the right word into a studio boss's ear, and his career rose in direct proportion to the list of his influential patrons. He was relentless in his desire to belong to high society, agreeing to the most humiliating terms of coexistence to get there. His cruelty revealed itself as total emotional detachment. He could imitate devotion to a woman who paid his bills for years, then coldly replace her with a more promising owner the moment her influence began to fade. The tragedy of Gary Cooper lay in the fact that his screen image of the incorruptible sheriff became his eternal curse, masking the reality of a man who never made decisions for himself. He was ungovernable in his craving for a luxurious lifestyle he could not provide on his own in the early years. Even when he married the wealthy social lioness Veronica Balfe, he merely exchanged one warden for another, continuing to seek protection from women who could strengthen his position. His cruelty toward himself was expressed in the voluntary renunciation of masculine dignity for the glitter of diamonds and the comfort of expensive limousines. Gary Cooper died a legend, but for those who knew him behind the scenes, he remained forever that same beautiful Harry, pleasing aging countesses and turning his life into an endless act of selling his own shadow. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the grandest deception Hollywood ever created. He was not merely an actor, but a living Frankenstein, assembled piece by piece by his notorious agent, Henry Wilson. His real name, Roy Scherer, was erased, his teeth corrected, his voice artificially lowered, his walk retrained. But the most terrifying part of this transformation was the role Hudson was forced to play in real life, the role of the perfect male body, made available to those who held power in the industry. His cruelty toward himself reached its peak when he agreed to become a tool in Wilson's hands, who traded Rock like a high-bred stallion. Hudson lost control of his fate the moment he understood that to become the king of Hollywood, he had to turn into an obedient slave in the bedrooms of those who paid the studio bills and dictated the terms of contracts. His life became an endless marathon of pleasing, domineering matrons and the wives of studio moguls. Henry Wilson, driven by a pathological hunger for control, used Hudson as bargaining currency. Rock was required to escort aging socialites to receptions, to be their attentive listener, and, when circumstances demanded it, to play the role of their secret lover. His cruelty revealed itself in the cold, mechanical execution of these duties. He put on a smile as part of the costume, while inside him grew a hatred for himself and for those who bought him. His thirst for fame was ungovernable, forcing him to turn a blind eye to the way his dignity was trampled for the sake of yet another glossy magazine spread. Every role he landed was paid for with hours spent in the company of women who saw him as nothing more than a beautiful, soulless ornament for their fading grandeur. Particularly cynical were his relationships with the so-called mistresses of the upper tiers of the film industry. For Rock to receive leading roles in romantic dramas, he had to be a flawless gigolo for those who whispered the right names into casting directors' ears. His life was stripped of privacy. Agents and patrons monitored his every step, even dictating his social circle. Hudson became a hostage to the image of the perfect American boy, who, in reality, was forced to indulge the whims of women whose age and temperament would have terrified anyone but a professional kept man. His cruelty toward others manifested in deep secrecy and lies, which became his second nature. He mastered the imitation of passion, both on screen and in life, turning into the perfect consumer product for wealthy women who longed to possess the man the entire world adored. Rock Hudson's tragedy was that he became Hollywood's most expensive and most miserable possession. His descent into hypocrisy was unstoppable. Even after he became a superstar, he remained dependent on the patronage system. His sham marriage to his agent's secretary was merely another image maintenance operation imposed by his so-called owners. Rock Hudson died without ever knowing what life without obligations to other people's wallets and desires felt like. He remains in history as proof that behind the most dazzling male beauty of the Golden Age often stood the fate of a gigolo, whose sole purpose was to be an obedient toy in the hands of those who pulled the strings of the dream factory.
Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power possessed a beauty that seemed almost unnatural, as if lifted straight from a Renaissance canvas. In Hollywood of the 1930s and 1940s, his face became the standard of the romantic hero. Yet behind this flawless facade lay the fate of a man taken hostage by his own genetic lottery ticket. Tyrone was the heir to a great acting dynasty, but his true inheritance amounted only to debts and ambition. He grasped very early that in a world ruled by money, his looks were his most liquid asset. His cruelty toward himself took the form of a voluntary transformation into a living accessory for those who could pay his bills and secure him a place on Olympus. Power lost control of his private life so swiftly that by 30 he had become a professional lover, whose real workday began when the studio lights at 20th Century Fox finally went dark. His path to fame was marked by a succession of affairs with women who were far older, more experienced, and, most importantly, immeasurably more powerful. Tyrone was unrestrained in his hunger for comfort and recognition, which made him perfect prey for the matrons of both the cinematic and aristocratic worlds. His cruelty revealed itself in a cold, almost surgical ability to seduce those who possessed resources. He did not merely please these women, he became their projection, their ideal boy, performing the role of a luxury escort. While the world saw him as the daring Zorro or a brave officer, in reality, Tyrone Power earned his status in the bedrooms of women who saw in him not a person, but an exotic pet purchased to adorn their bored and overindulged lives. One of the most vivid and simultaneously most disgraceful chapters of his biography as a kept man was his involvement with the already familiar Countess Dorothy de Frosso. The Countess, armed with the grip of a bulldog and a bank account the size of a small nation's budget, turned Power into her personal favorite. She paraded him across Europe, introduced him to royal households, and instructed him in the finer points of high society decadence. Power obediently endured her despotic temperament and public possessiveness, fully aware that her connections were his insurance policy in the industry. His cruelty toward others lay in absolute egocentrism. He burned through women's devotion as fuel for his career, discarding them from his life the moment a more advantageous match or a more powerful patroness appeared on the horizon. The tragedy of Tyrone Power was that he never managed to grow up or step out of the role of the golden boy kept at someone else's expense. He was ungovernable in his need for adoration, a hunger that drove him into the arms of ever new and ever more dominant women. Even his marriages were steeped in the spirit of dependency. He sought in women not partners, but sponsors for his image and shields against harsh reality. Until the end of his days, he remained a prisoner of his own beauty, a beauty that demanded constant outside investment. Tyrone died young, exhausted by the endless performance of the perfect lover for those he secretly despised. He remained in history as a symbol of the fact that in Hollywood, even the most beautiful face can be nothing more than a mask, concealing the obedient soul of a kept man who traded his masculine core for silk sheets and the favor of aging divas.
Clark Gable was the embodiment of raw, primal male power, the very image of a real man with a mocking gaze and an iron jaw no woman could resist. They called him the King, but this title was not bestowed by birthright or pure talent. It was bought, suffered through, and meticulously constructed by women whom Gable treated as expendable material on his climb to greatness. His cruelty knew no sentimentality. He regarded his benefactresses as steps on an escalator leading to the summit of Olympus. Gable lost control of his conscience in his youth, the moment he realized that his broad shoulders and predatory smile worked on mature women like a drug. He turned his life into a chain of strategic alliances, each success backed by the bank account of yet another matron who chose to invest in this charismatic brute. Before becoming an MGM icon, Clark Gable was a typical provincial gigolo, desperately clinging to the fringes of the theater world. His first major conquest was Josephine Dillon, a woman 17 years his senior, possessed of iron will and deep knowledge of acting craft. She saw potential in the awkward young man with protruding ears and invested everything in him. She paid for new teeth, taught him how to speak, how to move, how to look into the camera. Gable was ungovernable in his desire to escape poverty, so he obediently played the role of loving husband and devoted student while Josephine spent her last pennies promoting him. But once the foundation was laid and a studio contract appeared on the horizon, the king revealed his true nature. He discarded Dillon with icy ease as if she were an old prop. His cruelty lay in absolute ingratitude. He did not merely leave, he erased her name from his official biography, abandoning her to ruin and oblivion. But Gable's appetites only grew, and the next victim of his kept man strategy was Rhea Langham, a wealthy Texas socialite. She was older, more influential, and far richer. Rhea quite literally bought Gable a ticket into Hollywood's top league. She paid his debts, bought him the finest cars and tailored suits, and introduced him to circles closed to actors without pedigree. Gable was ungovernable in his cynicism. He played the devoted husband at studio receptions, while Rhea pulled strings to secure him roles in major productions. She turned him into a brand, and he paid her back in the bedroom, suppressing any irritation at her domineering control. For Gable, it was a job, hard, dirty, but necessary if one day the world was to kneel before the king. He was the perfect strategic gigolo, always knowing when to smile at an aging woman and when to deliver the fatal blow by walking away.
Clark Gable's tragedy was that even at the height of his fame, he could not rid himself of the stench of transaction that accompanied his rise. His cruelty toward women became legendary. He saw them only as resources, money, connections, or proof of his masculine dominance. He was ungovernable in his egocentrism, convinced the world owed him simply for existing. Clark Gable died a legend, but the foundation of his throne was mixed with the tears and shattered hopes of those patron mothers he pleased and betrayed with equal professionalism. He proved that the most masculine image in film history was built on the bedrock of classic gigoloism, turning genuine emotion into a tool for storming the heights of Hollywood.
Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor possessed a face his contemporaries called a divine mistake, so perfectly symmetrical and flawless that it seemed unreal. His cheekbones could cut glass, and his gaze promised eternal devotion, yet behind that beauty hid the most obedient and spineless instrument in the hands of Hollywood's elite. If Clark Gable was a predator who chose his own victims, Robert Taylor was a luxury commodity placed in the display window by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to satisfy the appetites of the most powerful women in the industry. His cruelty toward himself knew no limits. He willingly renounced the right to his own opinions, desires, and even his private life, becoming a golden slave in the hands of studio matrons. Taylor lost control of his destiny the moment he allowed himself to be turned into a living mannequin whose sole purpose was to remain impeccably beautiful and endlessly compliant. On set and beyond it, Taylor was surrounded by a tight circle of influential widows of shareholders and the wives of ranking producers who saw in him the perfect object for their fantasies. His cruelty revealed itself in an icy indifference to his own dignity. He meekly agreed to business dinners that ended in sealed bedrooms of mansions in Beverly Hills. He was ungovernable in his submission to the system, fully aware that his career depended entirely on the favor of these women. Taylor was a classic salon gigolo. He did not seek power, only the preservation of his status as the most beautiful man in the world, paying for it with his body and his time. His life lacked any masculine core. He was clay in the hands of women who molded him into either a romantic hero or a gallant cavalier, depending on which whim dominated their fading minds. A special role in his career was played by Barbara Stanwyck, a woman of steel will and colossal influence. Their marriage was not merely a union of two stars, but a carefully planned operation to tame Taylor. Stanwyck was older, wiser, and tougher. She became his unofficial manager and overseer. Robert was ungovernable in his dependence on strong women, and Barbara exploited this masterfully, turning him into her most successful asset. He served her ambitions, obeyed her schedule, and played the role of the ideal husband while she built his career brick by brick. Yet behind the scenes of this perfect marriage, Taylor remained prey for other powerful women of Hollywood, and his obedience allowed him to maneuver between his wife's interests and the whims of wealthy patronesses, turning his life into an endless act of servitude. The tragedy of Robert Taylor was that by the end of his life, he no longer knew who he was without his flawless cheekbones and someone else's guidance. His cruelty toward his own soul led to complete emotional burnout. He was ungovernable in his desire to be a good boy for all his mistresses, which drained his screen image of depth and life. Robert Taylor remained in history as the most beautiful man of the Golden Age, but those who saw the reverse side of his fame knew the truth. Behind that beauty lay the emptiness of a man who spent his entire life supported by powerful women, trading his will for the right to be called the idol of millions. He was the perfect gigolo, quiet, obedient, and dazzlingly beautiful, a slave in silk chains forged by Hollywood's elite.
Victor Mature was the walking oxymoron of the Golden Age, a man with the face of a Greek god and the body of a professional wrestler, whom studio bosses mockingly dubbed a beautiful misunderstanding. His hypertrophic musculature was his main, and often his only, acting argument. Yet in Hollywood's venomous back corridors, everyone knew the truth. Those biceps were not meant to rescue screen heroines from cardboard villains, but to please very real, terrifyingly powerful, and fabulously wealthy women who held all the strings of the industry. Mature was a new breed of coarse gigolo. He lacked Cary Grant's insinuating refinement or Tyrone Power's delicate aristocracy. His sole commodity was a primal, almost animal sexuality and brute physical force, which he put up for sale with the cynicism of a seasoned butcher. His cruelty lay in a crystal-clear absence of illusion. He understood perfectly well that his body was nothing more than a slab of meat wrapped in silk, and he traded it with the azart of a street dealer, willingly becoming a living toy in the hands of aging matrons and widows of film tycoons in search of carnal consolation. Mature's path to Olympus was not marked by years of rehearsal or a quest for Stanislavski's system. It was short, blunt, and ran straight through the most exclusive bedrooms of Beverly Hills. He was ungovernable in his hunger for total luxury and complete financial security, and for that he accepted without a flicker of shame the role of a domestic atlas for women whose age drew snide smiles and whose checkbooks inspired sacred awe. His cruelty toward himself lay in how brazenly he acknowledged his place in Hollywood's food chain. "I am not an actor, and I have 64 films to prove it." His famous line was not coy self-deprecation, but a statement of fact. He knew his career rested not on transformative talent, but on how professionally he satisfied the demands of his powerful patrons, turning intimacy into a commercial transaction with a fixed rate. He was the ideal object for women who, in the twilight of their lives, wanted to feel desired beside a mountain of muscle, obediently fulfilling any whim, no matter how exotic or degrading, for the appropriate reward. Victor Mature turned gigoloism into a form of athletic competition where the prizes were not medals, but contracts for lavish biblical epics like Samson and Delilah. His off-screen life was an endless series of so-called business trips to gated mansions where influential women awaited the physical ecstasy promised by a wild man's embrace. Mature was ungovernable in his bluntness. He never pretended to be an intellectual or a tortured poet. He was simply there when needed and vanished without explanation as soon as a patron's financial resources began to dry up or a more profitable match appeared on the horizon. His cruelty toward women naive enough to look for soul or sincerity in him was icy. He saw them only as payment terminals ensuring his comfortable existence. To many powerful Hollywood divas, he was something like an exotic pet or a living exercise machine, proudly paraded in public as undeniable proof of their undiminished feminine power. Victor obediently, and even with a certain relish, played the role of loyal bodyguard and tireless lover, while restaurant bills were paid by other hands, and his sculpted torso adorned movie posters around the world. He was a muscular slave of the system who learned the rules earlier than his peers and decided it was better to be a pampered, wealthy gigolo than an unrecognized and starving artist. Victor Mature's tragedy, if there was room for tragedy in his cynical universe, lay in the total and final loss of male independence. He grew so accustomed to women providing his life, his comforts, and his leisure that by the twilight of his career he ceased to see himself as an autonomous human being. His cruelty towards cinema itself, which he turned into a circus and a tool for personal profit, made him a permanent target of critics' ridicule. Mature merely laughed it off, counting diamonds and cash received from his benefactresses.
He entered history as a beautiful savage whose athleticism was sold off piece by piece to those who could afford to buy the illusion of strength and youth. He became living proof that in Hollywood's golden age, even the mightiest muscles were often nothing more than cheap scenery in the hands of women accustomed to getting absolutely everything, including the obedient devotion of the most physically perfect man on the planet.
Herbert Marshall. Herbert Marshall embodied what Hollywood liked to call continental charm, refined manners, an impeccable British accent, and the gaze of a man who had known profound sorrow. He was hailed as the most gallant man on screen, yet behind that noble polish lay one of the most sophisticated schemes of jiggallism in the history of the Dream Factory. Marshall lost a leg on the battlefields of the World War I, and what could have ended his career he instead turned into his greatest asset. He learned to use his limp and the image of the wounded hero as bait for the richest and most powerful women of his time. His cruelty was subtle, psychological. He awakened in his patrons a maternal instinct and a desire to become his savior, then methodically drained their bank accounts while preserving the mask of an unflappable aristocrat. Marshall sacrificed control over his own honor for a life of luxury he could never have afforded himself, becoming an elite kept man in silk gloves. On set, Marshall was a professional, but his real work began in private clubs and secluded estates where women starved for intellectual intimacy and a well-bred man awaited him. His cruelty revealed itself in cold manipulation of female emotions. He cultivated an aura of tragic loneliness, forcing powerful matrons to compete for the privilege of paying his bills at the finest tailors of London and New York. He was ungovernable in his pursuit of comfort. Marshall did not merely accept gifts, he made women feel it was a high honor to sponsor his aristocratic lifestyle. He gratified their egos with his presence, becoming the perfect trophy lover for those who lacked polish and European refinement. Herbert Marshall turned his disability into a tool of elite seduction, persuading the world of his nobility while living entirely at the expense of women enamored with him. A special place in his career as a kept man was occupied by relationships with divas such as Gloria Swanson and other screen queens, women who were older and incomparably wealthier than he was. He was ungovernable in his cynicism. Marshall could spend hours discussing poetry and art while his patroness signed a check for another shipment of collectible wine or antiques for his collection. His cruelty lay in total emotional detachment. He was a professional guest in other people's lives, always ready to trade one luxurious cage for another if better terms were offered. Women saw in him a refined lord in need of care. He saw in them nothing more than solvent admirers of his mythical aristocracy. Marshall indulged their craving for beauty, becoming living decor in their mansions, all while maintaining a reputation of crystal-clear integrity, the pinnacle of his acting skill and his calculation as a gigolo. The tragedy of Herbert Marshall was that by the end of his life he had completely lost the capacity for sincerity, turning into a hollow shell of his own screen persona. His cruelty toward himself as a man led him to cease seeing himself outside the context of others' patronage. He grew so accustomed to being paid for his manners and his tragic past that by the twilight of his career he was little more than a pale shadow of the aristocrat he had once invented to seduce wealthy widows. Herbert Marshall remained in history as the most refined gigolo of the Golden Age, a man who proved that a limp and a British accent could bring more money than any talent, if used skillfully in the bedrooms of powerful women.
He was a slave to his own comfort, trading independence for the eternal right to drink expensive cognac on someone else's expense, while remaining in the eyes of millions the last true gentleman.
Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was the most fragile, the most profound, and the most tragic face of Hollywood. He was called an angel with broken wings, but behind that poetic metaphor lay a monstrous reality. Clift was living merchandise, groomed from early childhood for the role of an elite kept man. His life was stripped of free will the moment his domineering, status-obsessed mother, Sunny Clift, decided that her son's beauty was the family's only ticket back into high society. Montgomery lost control of his identity as a teenager, becoming a hostage to maternal terror where every gesture and every glance was calculated to charm and appease those higher up the social ladder. His cruelty toward himself was boundless. He suppressed his true nature, turning into a submissive marionette in the hands of women who saw his vulnerability as the most refined aphrodisiac. His path in Hollywood was marked not only by acting triumphs, but by the status of a captive, passed from hand to hand among the industry's powerful matrons. His cruelty manifested as total self-destruction. He despised the role of the golden boy kept on a leash, yet he was ungovernable in his fear of losing protection. Clift became a collectible object for wealthy widows and aging divas who saw in his nervous charm and fallen angel beauty the perfect toy for their boudoirs. He was forced to stroke their egos, appearing at private receptions as a living ornament, while agents and his mother's inner circle struck deals behind his back. Montgomery Clift became a gigolo against his will, a man whose sexuality and tenderness were monetized by the system so ruthlessly that nothing of his own personality remained, only pain and a growing dependence on alcohol. A special place in this chronicle of bondage was occupied by his relationships with women who fancied themselves his saviors, but in reality only tightened the knot around his neck. He was ungovernable in his need for protection, which made him easy prey for powerful figures such as Elizabeth Taylor, whose friendship, though sincere, was also part of the studio machinery, and for countless other Hollywood mistresses who dictated how he should live and whom he was allowed to love. His cruelty toward those who genuinely tried to help him grew out of total distrust of the world. He saw every act of kindness as yet another attempt to buy him. Clift catered to women's appetite for the wounded, complicated man, fulfilling his role as the industry's most desirable sufferer, while his own life turned to ash. He was a gigolo who found no pleasure in his position and instead slowly died from it, sacrificing his beauty on the altars of other people's power. Montgomery Clift's tragedy reached its peak after the horrific car crash that mutilated his face. Even then, the system did not release him. His powerful patrons continued to exploit his broken image, turning his suffering into a new kind of commodity. His cruelty toward his own body, which he poisoned with pills and alcohol, became his only form of protest against the role of eternal dependent. He was ungovernable in his slow suicide, which stretched on for a decade. Montgomery Clift remains in history as the most tragic gigolo of the Golden Age, a man of extraordinary talent whose life belonged not to himself, but to a retinue of domineering old women and a tyrannical mother who turned him into the most expensive and most miserable slave in the history of cinema. He became a symbol of beauty soaked in blood and tears, proving that in Hollywood, even an angel could be traded in the bedrooms of those accustomed to buying souls for next to nothing. George Sanders. George Sanders was the undisputed king of Hollywood arrogance, a man whose velvety voice and icy gaze could make anyone feel insignificant. On screen, he specialized in the most refined villains, but in real life he was even more cynical. Sanders turned kept man living into a philosophy and a form of high art. He had relinquished control of his conscience so early that at the height of his fame he sincerely regarded work as a vulgar pastime for plebeians, preferring to please wealthy and powerful women in exchange for a life of pure sybaritic comfort. His cruelty was intellectual. He did not merely consume the resources of his patrons, he despised them for how easily they fell for his counterfeit aristocracy. Sanders was an elite parasite in a flawlessly tailored suit who perfected the art of living off others, transforming his laziness and contempt into the most desirable commodities in Hollywood's upper circles. His road to comfort was paved with the fortunes of women willing to pay any price just to be mocked by this sharp-tongued Briton in their own living rooms. Sanders was ungovernable in his egocentrism. He saw women as walking bank accounts, lightly seasoned with boredom that he generously agreed to relieve. His cruelty lay in a complete absence of empathy. He indulged their craving for a true lord while they covered his bills at exclusive clubs and bought him collectible cars. He was the archetypal intellectual gigolo, selling not only his body but his company, turning every dinner and every night into an act of subtle psychological domination over those who supported him. He played masterfully on the inferiority complexes of American millionairesses, persuading them that their money was a trivial fee for the privilege of existing in the shadow of his magnificent disdain. The most notorious episode of his kept man career was his marriage to Zsa Zsa Gabor, herself a professional hunter of fortunes. Yet even in this union of two predators, Sanders managed to retain the role of the dependent, compelling Zsa Zsa to finance his addiction to luxury. He was ungovernable in his devotion to idleness, spending his days stretched out by the pool while his owners busied themselves trying to satisfy his exacting tastes. His cruelty toward women lay in his refusal to offer warmth, only the cold brilliance of his intellect and caustic remarks, which they mistook for the highest form of sophistication. To Hollywood's powerful matrons, he was the most expensive and most dangerous ornament, capable at any moment of stinging its owner with venomous sarcasm. Sanders gratified their vanity, becoming living proof that even the purest strain of British arrogance could be bought. The tragedy of George Sanders, if the end of such a cynical life can be called a tragedy, was the absolute emptiness that remained when his beauty faded and the ranks of wealthy patrons thinned. His cruelty toward himself culminated in a final, chillingly calculated gesture. Realizing that he could no longer maintain the life of an elite parasite on the same terms, he chose to exit on his own conditions. He left behind a farewell message that became infamous for its icy wit and boredom with the world, perfectly consistent with the persona he had cultivated all his life. To the very end, Sanders remained an aesthete of dependence, a man who preferred disappearance to the humiliation of effort or compromise. He departed as he had lived, proving that in Hollywood one could survive for decades at someone else's expense, provided one possessed enough audacity and the talent to turn contempt itself into an object of desire for those who had everything except a trace of genuine aristocracy.
We conclude our descent into one of the most shameful and carefully concealed chapters of Hollywood's golden age, leaving behind the glittering facades of Beverly Hills mansions and peering into the emptiness of the souls of those the world once held up as ideals of masculinity. The paths of these 10 icons, Grant, Cooper, Hudson, Power, Gable, Taylor, Mature, Marshall, Clift, and Sanders have laid bare the brutal and cynical machinery of the dream factory, where a man's physique, gaze, and voice were nothing more than lots at a private auction of vice.
We have seen how behind impeccably tailored tuxedos and heroic poses stood men whose true talent lay in knowing when to bow their heads before the commanding hand holding the checkbook. These men did not merely play roles, they lived their lives as professional dependents, turning intimacy into currency and sincere emotion into a tool of career advancement. The cruelty of this system lay in stripping them of the right to their own will, reducing them to living accessories for the industry's matrons who used youth and beauty as weapons against their own fading and boredom. We witnessed different shades of this descent, the cold, strategic calculation of Clark Gable, the tragic, hopeless enslavement of Montgomery Clift, the muscular cynicism of Victor Mature, the poisonous, death-tinged disillusionment of George Sanders. Each paid a price for a place on Olympus, and that price always included the partial or total loss of masculine core. The golden age, so often bathed in the soft glow of nostalgia, revealed itself as a vast market of flesh, where powerful old women, widows of magnates, heads of studio clans, and aging divas set the terms, breaking the lives of those who dared to dream of fame without protection. These stories serve as a harsh reminder that behind every blinding triumph there is often a long chain of compromises made in the half-light of expensive bedrooms, and that the title of King of the Screen was frequently purchased with servile submission to those who wielded real financial power. Now that the masks of the perfect gentleman have been torn away, we see the true cost of the Hollywood dream, not only sweat and tears, but dignity sold and sealed into the foundations of great cinematic legends. For these heroes, the road to eternity ran through gilded cages, and though their names are carved into the Walk of Fame, the shadows of their patrons still stand behind every frame, reminding us that in this city of angels, even the brightest star has an owner. This is the final chapter of a chronicle of male downfall, one that forces us to look differently at every on-screen feat, knowing precisely whose hands held the strings that guided these great marionettes.